I want to say just a couple of quick words about PAN and how our work relates to the two principles that we'll be diving into in this panel. Many of you know Pesticide Action Network. We've been working for over 30 years, 34 now, 33, with at an international level to promote sustainable and safe and sustainable alternatives to harmful pesticides. PAN North America is one of five regional centers around the world. We have offices in California and now here in Minneapolis. In terms of how our work links to or is grounded in these principles of worker dignity and safe food for all, PAN has for many years been working with farm worker advocates to promote policies and practice that protect farm workers and their families from pesticide exposure. We think worker dignity has a lot to do with a healthy workplace. In terms of safe food for all, I think food safety includes, in our mind, an increasingly important and urgent attention to the field to fork exposures to harmful pesticides that as the science is showing, have real impacts on public health and especially on children's health. And so that's our piece of the conversation about food safety that we again think is really important and part of that broader conversation. I think we have a really interesting and exciting discussion coming up for the next hour. I think we'll all be stretched a little bit once again. Scott mentioned in the earlier panel that we get to quote some of our favorite quotes, and I want to quote him. One of the things that he just said I think is really important, which is that we need to challenge ourselves to think about system change rather than looking at the symptoms. And I think in all of our work, often we're so busy, battling the often big symptoms of the problematic system that we have in place, and we have an opportunity today to really step back and think, okay, what changes to the system do we need and do we want, and how can we learn from each other to get there? So I remind you all to note down your questions as we go. We're going to have both presentations, brief presentations, again 5 to 10 minutes to put some ideas out on the table, and then we'll have plenty of time to talk those through. So I think I'll hand the mic over to Jose. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Hello? Hello? All right, I'll step.
Trying to avoid this, but that's okay. So yeah, as I was saying, thank you IATP for inviting both ROC and Food Chain Workers Alliance to be part of this conversation. I do think it's a really critical conversation, and I think it's asking some of the right questions. I think the framing for the panel is perfect, and I don't want to mess it up by trying to talk too much. I think what I want to do is actually give you all a few questions to think about or ideas to sort of posit and put them out there on the table for us all. The first one I think is, just in the way of introducing my organizations, I want to tell you about an exercise that we do with our members. So for those of you who don't know, the Restaurant Opportunity Center, ROC, started in 2001, right after September 11th. There used to be a restaurant on the top of the World Trade Center that was called Windows on the World, and that restaurant, unfortunately, on September 11th was destroyed. 73 workers died that day. The survivors came together because they had a great workplace where they were at Windows. Vacation, health care, paid sick days, etc., which is unheard of in the restaurant industry. So they came together basically to create that workplace in the rest of the industry. They knew that it was possible because they worked at a restaurant that had those things, so they wanted to create those working conditions in the rest of the industry. In the course of doing so, they realized that they alone were isolated as a segment of a much bigger chain, right, that starts in the fields. The food that folks were serving in the restaurants that they were organizing in was being grown, in some cases, thousands of miles away, and they had no connection to those workers. And so we actually started to reach out to some of the organizations that represented those workers both farm workers and food processing workers and warehouse workers, et cetera, started to come together in these sort of informal conversations, much like this, right? A very informal setting where we were just talking about how our industries were similar and how they were different. And in the course of doing that, we realized that we were really all talking across silos and that we needed to come together. And the formation of the Food Chain Workers Alliance happened as a conclusion to that, right? And today there's 25 organizations representing over 250,000 workers, including ROC, obviously, UFCW, Unite Here. So there's unions, and then there's also obviously worker centers, smaller groups like the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, Scott who's here. The vision really of the Food Chain Workers Alliance is something that Liz said earlier in the panel before. It's really about power, right? And I'm so glad that that's actually coming out right now here in this setting, because that, to me, is the context in which we have to look at our work beyond the Farm Bill. We are not going to compete with money, right? We've already said that. And there's absolutely no way that we're going to be matching their lobbying efforts in their relationships, because they have relationships that are deep with the people who are making those decisions. So what I want to do is I want to tell you a little exercise that we do called power soccer. Who here has ever done power soccer? Awesome, so I'm talking to you. Okay, well, you've probably done it. So the way that this works is, if we were actually going to do this, it'd be awesome actually if I could get you guys to actually do this. We'd have to move the tables out of the way. And then, let's say that there's 50 people in this room. 40 people would be in one team, and we'd be on this side, and 10 people would be on the other team on that side. And the 40 people on this side have to guard the goal, which is, it's just like regular soccer, right? But the goal is this entire wall. The 10 people, the small team, has a small goal. So it's, 2 chairs about 4 feet apart from each other. That's their goal. And it's like regular soccer. So you have a ball, and you put it in the middle, and you let people try to score. There's only one difference between that form of soccer, power soccer, which is also referred to as soccer for suckers, and regular soccer. And that is that the small team gets to call timeout at any point during the game, and they get to change the rules. Anyway, so that small team oftentimes says, oh, we can play with our hands. And they grab the ball, but you guys can't, right? The big team can't. And so they grab the ball and they come and they just throw it up against the wall and they score. Or the big team, you all have to hop on one foot. You cannot play with 2 feet. And the result of this whole exercise is actually, you guys can imagine, right? Usually the small team wins by a large margin. Usually the large team doesn't score at all, although sometimes they manage to get a goal in there somehow. But they never win. That small team never wins. And there's a referee, right? I would be the referee in this case, right? I would make sure that when that small team, calls a timeout, that we stop playing, and that the small team gets a chance to say what the new rule is. And what do you think people do usually in this situation? They just follow the rules. They do what they're told they have to do. And that's as far as they can think in that situation, because they're being told, this is the game, I'm the referee, you do what I say, right? At the end of the whole game, we end the game, small team 100 and large team 2, and we all sit around and we discuss, why did that small team win? They were so few, but they won by such a large margin. And people get it, right? They immediately understand, well, we weren't organized. We didn't know what was going on, and we were thrown into the middle of the game. The rules were being made by that small team. And the question that I often ask people is, well, who really has the power in that situation? And, you know, you get different answers. Of course, a small team, right? And they have a lot of power, that's true, but that's not who is controlling the game. It's the referee, ultimately, that is controlling the game, that can stop the game from moving forward, that actually makes both sides do what the small team wants them to do, right? And then I ask people, what are the parallels in the food system? Who's the small team? Who's the large team? Or what are the parallels in our society at large? And people understand very clearly, especially workers, right? They understand, oh, large team is us, workers. And the small team is, you know, the 1%, right? The people who have everything and own everything. And the government is the referee. And so the challenge here, and the challenge to you all today is, if we are thinking beyond the Farm Bill, and if we are thinking systemically, then who should be leading that? And more importantly, what is the outcome that we want? Because the outcome is going to shape who is leading, right? To me, there's a clear narrative, right? Workers at the front, because I come from a worker organization. But there's more than workers represented in this room, right? And there's certainly more than workers who have a stake in our food system, right? There's farmers, there's consumers, and there's everyone in between. So it's a question and a challenge for us here, right? Who should be leading, and what do we want? What is the outcome that we want from this? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jose. This on? Is that on? No? Yes? Yeah. I think that we have some slides from Colin.
Yes, I decided to be the oddball and put together a slideshow very late last night. So you guys can look over here for a second. In the meantime, while Patrick is setting that up, I would first want to say thank you to IATP for pulling this really unique group together. I feel like a lot of us, and it's good to finally also put some faces to names. I know it bugged many of you via email, but also there are times where we get to travel across the country in various little meetings, but this is a really unique group of people and a unique space, I think, beyond the Farm Bill, and I'd like to even say beyond food safety is what I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about. So I'm the Director of Government Affairs at the Center for Food Safety. We're a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C., where we advocate essentially for sustainable alternatives to industrial agriculture. You'll have to forgive the slides. It was, like I said, very late at night. So, you know, our mission is really to protect public health and the environment from the harmful impacts of industrial agriculture, our industrial food system, and instead nurture a sustainable food future. We often approach the issue with this phrase: stop the bleeding, fix the problem, and shift the consciousness. And Liz already teed this up with needing to shift the narrative. And I know for many of you in this room that focus solely on the stopping the bleeding aspect, that we feel all too often more like surgeons than advocates for an issue, where we try to stop the bleeding and we don't have the time or the resources or the staff to focus on fixing the problem and shifting the consciousness. So I think it's really important that all of these people are in this room to talk about it. So in an effort to define food safety more broadly, these are a couple core pillars that we approach the issue from: environmentally sustainable, biologically diverse, local and appropriate scale, socially just, humane, climate friendly, nutritious, transparent, and properly labeled. Just a couple core principles to reconsider how we talk about food safety. I think sometimes, and particularly within the Food Safety Modernization Act discussions right now, we're in an unfortunate place where we're at odds with one another. Consumer groups at odds with farmer groups. Now, we're all headed to the same goal, but how we get there is the question. And I hope that we can spend a little bit of our time today talking about that. So a couple key discussion areas, and for everyone works on food safety when you think about it, and everyone has food safety and safe food for all amongst their core mission. Who could be against it? So a couple key areas, food safety being reactionary versus preventative food safety measures. When we're talking about the regulation and oversight of genetically engineered crops, particularly the pesticide promoting crops, those that are engineered to withstand exposure to herbicides. Lack of federal oversight, and then also lack of federal leadership to properly regulate genetically engineered foods and crops. When we talk about animal drugs, the non-therapeutic use of antibiotics, as well as growth promoters, such as arsenic or ractopamine. So if you're dealing with this on the farm or dealing with phytosanitary standards in the international context, obviously a hot button discussion area. Food additives, USDA's organic standards, and then other indicators of food safety that also help direct food security, like honeybees and pollinators, where we're seeing tremendous die-offs. Now, on the stopping the bleeding aspect, the goal of challenging harmful food production practices, the lack of oversight, as well as the industry's attacks, we focus on both legal, policy, and grassroots actions, and many of you in this room do the same. So just a couple examples of stopping the bleeding. First, Food Safety Modernization Act. CFS recently had to sue the FDA for failing to comply with Congress's 18-month deadline to begin the Food Safety Modernization Act regulation publication process. Congress, when passing FSMA, responsibly allocated deadlines for FDA to begin the process, recognizing the need for vital food safety regulations and life-saving provisions of FSMA to go into action. Now, we'll talk about FSMA a little later because how it's implemented is also a challenge. GE crop litigation, challenging arsenic in animal feed, legal petitions, threats of lawsuit, as well as state challenges. Folks like Food and Water Watch and the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future have done a great job about addressing this at the state level, and then many of you addressing it even more locally. Addressing food additives, defeating the Monsanto Protection Act, another bellwether of food safety. Now, many people wouldn't think of it as strict food safety. However, in our mind, when you're talking about the core pillars, it really does fit within that. Challenging neonic insecticide. These are systemic insecticides linked to honeybee and pollinator declines, and the use of members of Congress to be advocates in addition to their own legislative fixes. There we go. So shifting to fixing the problem. A couple congressional actions. Obviously, the Organic Foods Production Act, a clear indication of trying to fix the problem. FSMA, as we say, just a much needed first step. The first step towards reforming our food safety regulations. Here, a list of bills which have been introduced, amendments that have been introduced, some of which have passed, and some of which are just really just a glimpse of what's to come. But I think all, once again, looking for how we can be moving forward. But another key area is state and local actions. As I mentioned earlier, the Maryland arsenic ban in 2013, state GE labeling bills being introduced, ballot initiatives, and laws being passed. We've seen the industry spend over $65 million between California and Washington State to oppose consumers' right to know what they're buying and feeding their families. Obviously, it's no surprise to you, but it's an indicator of what the industry is willing to do to keep consumers in the dark about knowing what they're buying and feeding their families. Kauai's pesticide ordinance, which simply restricts the use of, or the spraying on field trials of genetically engineered crops, the spraying of pesticides near hospitals, residential areas, and schools, as well as reporting requirements. What are these field trial pesticides? What pesticides are they using, and what are they spraying? The people living next to them should have a fundamental right to know what that is. Going to the neonics, obviously Oregon's been an advocate after seeing a major die-off of bumblebee and a acute bumblebee kill last year, but Alaska and Maryland on GE fish. And then certainly international efforts, so Codex, other UN conventions, trade talks being a way not necessarily to fix the problem, but elevate the importance of the issue and hopefully then shift the consciousness. And Kathy brought up already certain mergers and acquisitions, Smithfield being another one, where that offers a very different issue when we're talking about the use of ractopamine. And then moving forward, then shifting the consciousness, reframing food safety more broadly. How can we do that? For our memberships and for our networks, connecting those of us in the room, hopefully then introducing these key concepts, and what CFS, I know many here, feel that USDA's organic standards should be the floor of all US agriculture, not the ceiling. Finally, just teeing up some challenges and then also opportunities. One tremendous challenge right now is defeating this next generation of genetically engineered crops, engineered to withstand exposure to older, more toxic herbicides like 2,4-D and dicamba. USDA's poultry rule, FSMA implementation, new technologies which are already on the marketplace, such as nanotechnology and synthetic biology, reforming how we field trial genetically engineered crops, USDA's discussion about supposed coexistence between conventional, biotech, and organic. And then also, how do we meet U.S. consumer demand for organic with U.S. supply? So a couple broad issues, tee up the conversation, and I look forward to your feedback and how we can better connect our networks.
Great. Thank you, Colin. I guess I'll get up. Thanks very much to both of our panelists. I think there's a lot on the table. It occurs to me that kind of thinking back to where we landed with the last panel, maybe a question for us to think about is which of these many vehicles that are kind of in motion that we, various groups are engaged with offer the best opportunities for power building, and how do we do that? I think that's one question to think about. I think the other really big picture question is around the narrative, because I think that narrative of, we need to feed the world with our, conventional systems of agriculture, we bump up against that all the time. I think we all do. And so how do we, as, all the groups, various groups working on different angles of this issue, how do we confront that? What's the alternative narrative? And as Jose said, who's leading? Who's defining what that narrative should be? So with that, maybe I'll start by asking the panelists to, if you have any comments on each other's presentations or observations, and then we'll open up for questions. Jose, or anybody?
Sure. I don't know if it's much of a comment on your presentation. I think it's more things I forgot to say. One thing that I wanted to make sure that was out there as an idea. We've been thinking about this for quite some time now. We have data, right? We've done a ton of research on this. Food safety and food overall, the product itself, how good it is, has a lot to do with worker safety and worker well-being at every step in that food chain, right? So if you're talking about poultry, line speed has a huge impact on whether that chicken that you're going to buy is going to be good or not, right? And so we've been thinking a lot about how do we tie USDA or FDA regs to Fair Labor Standards Act regs, right? So that the letter grade that the product gets isn't just about how, quote unquote, healthy that food is or how, good the product is, but it's also tied to how much were workers making on the line that made that product or that processed that product. Did they have things like paid sick days? Did they have a union, right? Like those kinds of very basic necessities in life. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And then the other small thing, I'm so sorry, I'm hijacking your question. But the other thing is, that we being Food Chain Workers Alliance and ROC are working together with actually Navina, who's here, Movement Strategy Center and Real Food Challenge and Union of Concerned Scientists to sort of pull together also a group of folks to have these conversations as well. So I'm really glad to see this conversation here. I want the conversation to actually, hopefully, inspire a bigger, almost, I'm almost envisioning kind of a movement roundtable kind of thing where everyone is able to sort of bring these ideas to the fore. Sorry to hijack here.
That's great. Anything to add?
Yeah, and I think only so.
You can use my mic. Here.
Thank you. My only comment, and first comment, I think a lot of people would agree, is I would be really interested to see how power soccer would work with this group. So maybe after hours power soccer. But I think you brought up a really great point, which is that when you fix one problem, you oftentimes fix another problem. And how can we bring together those diverse stakeholders and those diverse groups? I certainly, I wear a lot of DC hats, so I'm going to save my comment and look forward to hearing what other people have to say and about how we can also then hopefully leverage those good ideas into other channels beyond the Farm Bill that are happening in Washington, D.C., where there is that power play. And we do have some leverage, but a lot of it is how can we make sure that all of the voices are being heard.
Great, thank you. All right, so do we have our microphone? Great. So anyone want to start us off? There's a lot on the table. Yes, in the back.
Good morning, I'm Richard Idlin with the American Sustainable Business Council. So I don't know, we work with a number of the organizations in this room, and for those of you who don't know us, we're a public policy organization based in DC that brings the business voice to the conversation about building a just, vibrant, and sustainable economy. And we do that by mobilizing companies. So within the ag space, we work with companies like Stonyfield and Ben & Jerry's and Cliff Bar and New Belgium Brewing and lots of other companies. And so to your question about building power, we feel there's a great opportunity to work with all of you in the room to bring forth that business voice that are concerned about all the same issues that we're talking about here, whether it's trade policy and pushing back on the TPP, or whether it's about the minimum wage and paid sick leave, which we've been working with Rock and Raise on, or agricultural subsidies or GMO labeling. So those are issues we work on in Washington, D.C., both in Congress and in the agencies, and also with the White House. And then at the state level, because of our organizational structure, we have about 75 business organizational partners across the country. Some are place-based, others are issue-centric, and others are national. So I think my comment is really that we're here to partner and build a stronger movement and change the narrative by bringing business people to the table who share these values. Because what we find when we're in DC or in state capitals is when you show up as a business person, you have credibility immediately, whether it's warranted or not. You do. And you get a different listening than you might if you're wearing a different hat. So good to be here this morning.
Great, thank you. And I think that goes to a point made earlier as well about the power of unexpected alliances. That if you come into a room, with partnering business and labor, business and farmers in different ways than it's been done before, you're going to get a different level of attention. Either of you have any comments on? Okay. Other comments on the question of power building or changing the narrative? Yeah, Dennis.
Dennis Olson again. I would just like to throw out here, pick up on Jose's point about the level of safety at the workers level and that point. To take it a step further in the fact that I actually, as many people in this room know, didn't come from the labor movement. So I've learned quite a bit, and one of the things I've learned about is union contracts. And so I think we need to take this a step further than just whether it's wages or healthcare, or healthcare is part of it, but we also need to think about it as workers' rights on the line, and that's where I've been educated a little bit. So on meatpacking lines in our contracts, we actually have a provision that when our stewards think they can time the lines, and if they think they're going too fast, there's actually limits in the contracts on how fast they can run the lines. And our stewards can actually shut down a line. And they shut it down, and by the contract, it goes to binding arbitration. And just the fact that we have the power to shut down that line is huge leverage on on a whole range of issues. And so I think it goes to this point about how do we level the playing field in the power soccer. I think we need to and I think the labor unions movement needs to do a better job of articulating, why contracts are important, why the right to organize is important, and why worker rights are important. Because the other thing that we've done is we've actually done studies of plants and found that food safety is higher in plants where workers have union contracts because they're freer. They're not always free. It depends on how good the contracting is, but they're freer than a non-union contract to call the company out. They're going to feel more comfortable because their job is protected. They have the due process in a union contract. They can't just get fired for whistleblowing and that sort of thing. So I just think that that's something we need to think about.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, that's that same principle, but applied to the entire food system, right? From the farm, literally to the fork, is the idea that I'm proposing for us to think about here, right? And connecting FILSA, the Fair Labor Standards Act, with, I don't know, actually, if it would be the FDA, maybe the USDA, one of the, or maybe both, right? In creating the sort of broadly accepted evidence, both data and anecdotal, that better working conditions produces better food.
And to me, that's shifting the narrative when people understand that, I think it's meeting people where they are in terms of being concerned about food safety, what you buy in the marketplace, but knowing what that means in terms of the safety of workers and the conditions all the way down the chain. At Field to Fork, I've heard it called plow to plate. I think it's really a powerful idea. And I was going to mention, many of you know my colleague Margaret Reeves, and she's been working for a number of years on the Equitable Food Initiative, which is a collaborative of retailers and worker groups and environmental health groups that are developing a standard that tries to capture some of these all the way along the food system chain. So there's some exciting opportunities. Juliet, thank you.
Thank you. I think that when we're talking about power, we have been talking a lot about making the rules, some about following the rules, and I would really like to have some more conversations about breaking the rules.
Yes.
Breaking the rules. One of the things, it was very interesting, Liz, hearing more about what you all are doing on stopping fast track, for example. We have some rules going on in the transatlantic trade agreement that have a lot to do with power and holding on to that power. And that is, of course, that these agreements are secret. And they're secret from everybody. They're secret from our Congress people. They're secret from us. And they're openly secret, as it were. A lot of people are breaking the rules. They're leaking. These negotiating texts are leaking out. It's like a colander. We're seeing the negotiating text. We're able to do something about it. But, the U.S. Trade Representative is catching up to all of this, and the European negotiators are catching up to it. And so they are trying to co-opt our participation in their secret advisory groups so that we could have access to those negotiating texts as long as we sign an agreement that says that we won't tell anybody what's in them or we face going to jail. So there are a lot of opportunities here for breaking rules in planned, coordinated, and legal ways that I think we ought to think about a little bit more.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to say one thing to that, and that is, there's really only a few forms of power right? There's money, organized money, and then there's organized people, at least in terms of what's relevant for this group. Those are really the only two forms of power that we're talking about. And organized people is the only one that's accessible to us, or it's the only one that's actually possible for us to build. We're not going to compete with them on organized money. Right? And so that's where the question of, well, who is the organized people that are going to be leading this comes into play, because if you don't see yourself in that, and I do believe that that's one of the reasons why we don't have an actual movement right now, is because people don't see themselves in it, right? And to the extent that they don't see themselves in it, and that does go to a great extent to the question of race, it goes to the question of class, right? Who are people going to associate with? Who are they going to, feel like is speaking to them? And so I think that that's a critical piece of it. Yeah, breaking the rules is a huge part of it, but it has to be done in the context of the people who are leading feeling comfortable with breaking those rules and making the people in power uncomfortable when those rules are broken. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So,
Colin, do you want to add anything about kind of the role? To me, the role of the referee is also really important in that scenario, and I think that's the work that you folks do. It's like that. How do you influence the folks that are enforcing those rules?
Sure. Yeah, and I think as we've seen, when the referee doesn't even follow the rules, we as the outsider watching the game have to come in. Because unfortunately, the referee in this game is largely, whether it's the FDA or the USDA or the EPA, are not holding those people on the small team accountable for what they're doing when they decide to change the rules, because they do break the rules. And Robert Kennedy Jr. is famous for saying that the large industrial CAFOs can't exist without breaking the law. And that's very true. And I think when we look at a lot of the segments of the industrial food system, they can't exist without breaking the law. And it's our duty, and what Center for Food Safety has done with so many of your help over the past 2 decades, is to ensure that those people who are breaking the law are held accountable for it. With that said, we can't rely on the backstop being holding the bad guys, the people who are willing to break the law, accountable for maybe they will trust it this time, because we need to be doing what we can to then shift the consciousness, reframing that narrative. But when it comes to food safety, FSMA implementation, or regulation of pesticides, it's important to have these independent arbiters to hold the referees accountable.
Thank you. In the middle table here, and then Kathy.
Larry E. with the Food Commons, and maybe my question is a segue to the session right after lunch, which I'm moderating. So. My question is what happens, Jose, if we change the rules of the game? I mean, in our economic system today, labor is separated from capital. What happens if we join labor and capital? And I'd like you to comment on, the notion of employee-owned businesses, worker-owned businesses.
yes, yeah, no, I mean, at Rock, we have a couple of those, the 2 worker-owned cooperatives, one in New York, one in Detroit, called Colors. I definitely think that there's big picture thinking that needs to happen. That's why I love this conversation, because I think that's what we're doing, right? It's not just thinking about how do we tweak the rules so that they, or how do we, hold the referee accountable when we catch them ignoring the rule breaking that's happening from the small team. But it's actually, let's get rid of this game, right? Let's play a different game. And so I like that. I like the idea of, we don't need bosses, right? We can be our own bosses. We could be the employers ourselves. And that gives you a stake, not just in the development of that business and the bottom line of the business, but it gives you a stake in the sustainability of the overall system that makes that business possible, right? I don't know if that's possible right now. I think we have, we're at the stage, someone said earlier, of advanced capitalism, where there's a conglomeration of corporate power at such a degree that the self-interest of those corporations are going to drive both the small team and the referees in a very self-destructive direction. But they have no, I heard a business person actually frame it this way. Capitalism as a whole knows that they're in trouble because there's a downward push on wages and benefits, and that means there are less people, less consumers that are able to afford the services and goods that capitalism is producing. But if one individual capitalist is asked to improve wages and conditions, you're putting that person out and they are unable to survive because the push is downward, not upward. And so it has to be either a total push upward or capitalism has to collapse, right? But we're in this, we're being driven in this direction by the market forces themselves. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Thank you. Kathy, I think you're up next.
So I wanted to follow up on Juliet's comment about fast track, and part of it is it's also taking away the power from our members of Congress, those who have been there standing up on some of these issues. So when 150 Democratic members of Congress sent a letter to the president saying, you know, we are not with you on fast track unless some different issues happen or there's some conversations, help to kind of stop that process and give us some space now to be organizing and doing a lot of the work that needs to happen. And then one other comment is just, and it's sort of been alluded to, but I think, you know, who are the voices that are delivering the message is really important, and to confront whether it's farmers or workers being the ones being able to be really clear on what their solutions are and what the real issues need to be as we all discuss it is key. So, thanks.
Comments? Yeah, no? Yeah, go ahead. And then the mayor.
There are two forms of power, the money and the people, but I think what we've referred to also is maybe one or two other ones, including the narrative. You know, there's the power of what people think is possible and what power people think they have. And I think that's one of the big potentials that we have and our groups have. I mean, the point was made earlier, it's true. I mean, just all of us together and all the other groups that wanted to be here are not going to be enough. But I think that what we do have is a lot of us have vision, we've got grassroots connections, we've got alternatives that are started to work, and Scott was right. I mean, we need to be engaged in the data too, but the power of stories, the power of Fred's farm or other farms is like, no, we have something that does work, that is appealing. And I think that we need to also keep focusing on that there are all these positive examples. And at least in my experiences previously as a teacher, people they get really excited, like, wait, we can do it differently? And so I think that we have a huge potential there to motivate people because we do have this other story that I think actually works pretty well and is what a lot of people actually want. They don't necessarily want this corporate vision and this pushing downwards. And so I think that's the potential for us to try and spread our roots in lots of different groups and lower the barriers to entry. I think that's the big thing we need to do is figure out many ways for people to get involved with our groups, with this kind of movement, and build it into more of a movement where people can come in and out more easily and support things, as opposed to everything being sort of the last campaign that everyone needs to be on deck at the same time and gets exhausted, to build that long-term continuity.
Well, and I think touching on that, you bring up a great point, and I think we're going to talk about it later today, which is we have a problem talking about organic being the base and the floor and not the ceiling, because there's a perception of organic, right? There's a perception of local, sustainable. It's reframing the conversation, but also making it affordable, equitable, and easily digestible for people to understand, as well as physically. But because I think, especially when we're talking about this, the challenge is we're speaking at the 50, 100,000 feet level. How do we, and I think the power soccer is a really good metaphor for how we're going to be talking about these issues moving forward and deciding, is this the arena where we want to be talking about it? rather than, there will always be, CFS is always going to be yelling from the outside, telling the referee that they made a bad call. But there are other people that say, maybe we don't need to be yelling, maybe we should go play another game.
One really, really quick, I talk a lot, I'm sorry. But one really quick comment on what you're saying. I mean, the word power in Spanish is poder, which means to be able to do. Right? So power isn't something external. It's basically, can we do something?
Mm-hmm.
If you can, you have power. If you can't, then you don't, right? So if the stories that you're talking about are going to get something done, then they are power. They are a form of power, but the measure of it is, are they able to do something, right? Are they able to move the target to give us what we want?
I think that's a really good point, and I come back to the example of the DOJ hearings that my colleague Marcia Ishii-Eiteman was a part of as well, and many people in the room, and it was incredible mobilization there, but it's then, what do you do with that power and that involvement and that engagement and harnessing that in a direction that we all want to go together. We have a couple, Mayor of Madison.
Hi. Maybe I've got a couple of questions rather than anything else, but let me preface what I want to share with the notion that one of the problems is that we've lost the recognition of redistribution within our society, that the concept of the U.S. Post Office, which is we're going to deliver a letter to the most remote place in the United States at the same price as it costs to send it across the street, has a certain economic advantage to all of us in terms of building an economy. The same thing is true in terms of rural electrification, telephones. Now we see it with the digital divide. And let me just ask the question, which is, how many of you think that Uber or Lyft are really neat with their application of their new technology? But actually, they pose a threat to the sustainability of certain kinds of transit systems and public transportation throughout the United States, because they are cherry picking the very best. And what's this relevant to this conversation is that there are all these separate discussions taking place. I don't know how many people here were first week or second week of February at the Sustainability Conference in Denver. Probably about 400 or 500 people discussing much of the same topic. I'm leaving tonight to go to the Racial Equity Conference in Portland tomorrow, or anybody going to that? This is going to be a major topic on the agenda, particularly the issues of food, sustainability, neighborhoods, and so on. Then there's the nightmare of what happened 20 years ago in terms of NAFTA, which we're revisiting. And I guess the feeling I'm getting from the last several panels is that we've got to bring together all these organizations, which are operating on different tracks and different subject areas, but are basically operating from the same philosophical base, working the same constituency, but particularly, I want to go back to my comments this morning, particularly as it relates to food, we have barely tapped the resources that are out there. I mean, in the urban and the suburban areas, the lack of knowledge about what happened to SNAP, the lack of information in regards to what this Farm Bill meant, the opportunities that we've got in terms of the small connections that can be made, whether it's a discussion about suddenly using public parks for community gardens, or yes, allowing the raising of bees and chickens in residential neighborhoods, or just opening up the marketplace to food carts, or doing what they did in Baltimore in terms of the discussion on going into the small corner markets and helping the merchants change what was on the shelves. I'm kind of down on the fact that there seems to be a giant mountain we have to climb, but I'm kind of optimistic because I see tremendous untapped potential out there.
Thank you. So I think I have two more questions in the back of the room and then here at this table, and then I'll ask the speakers to respond to the last batch of questions and then wrap up and kind of look forward to where we go from here. So back, the jacket. That's you. Oh, you're gonna pass?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think, did you have a comment? Thank you.
No, actually, I'm doing this to unburden myself because this has weighed badly on me for several years. My name is Carolyn Mugar, and I'm with Farm Aid, and a lot of us in this room have worked together. But I want us to ask ourselves, because I blame myself, why were we not able to mobilize after the fiasco of the DOJ hearings? Everybody agreed that it was a moment. And I ask myself, I blame myself, but it's not that we don't know how to do it. People here know how to do it because we've demonstrated over and over again tremendous successes. I mean, LSP, Rafi, work, et cetera, was a real crisis, the whole thing. But I just want to know why we didn't mobilize then. Thank you.
All right, so I think I'm going to turn it back to you folks for kind of responding to that
Sure.
question and also any final
That's a great
comments.
question. And, I think one of the challenges that we have, and it's no secret, is that while, the issues that we fight, we may be fighting one industry that focuses on one core issue, or there's some, the Republican Party every year picks 3 big issues, 3 topics to work on, and they only work on those 3 issues. We don't have that same fortune, and I know everyone is juggling multiple balls in the air, and so we have one issue, and then once there's some type of change, we have to move on to other things. And that is certainly a challenge that I think we should accept that that's the political reality that we all face. With that said, that doesn't mean that we can't then in turn shift some of our priorities or just better connect. I think these conversations have highlighted that we can do a better job of connecting with networks so that maybe the next time there's a watershed moment like the DOJ hearings, we don't just move on to the next fire and put it out, and rather focus our time working with the journalists, working with everyone else to help uplift the importance of that. Then I'd also just reiterate that, from our vantage point representing the hundreds of thousands of consumers that we have, we often say that food is the most intimate experience that consumers have with the environment. And I think for most consumers who don't necessarily get to see the worker issues, the worker justice issues, the farmer justice issues, or even the environmental components, this is an entry point for them to begin these discussions. And I think Safe Food for All is a really great way of pivoting that, because who can be against safe food for all? But it means so much more, and so I'd encourage us to keep considering it in that broader subset.
I know we're almost completely out of time, so I'll try to be brief than I am. I really do think that we're done. We're at a point now where we don't think that minutia or tweaking or small changes are in any way going to give us the result that we need. And I think it's for a variety of reasons, but just historically we've come to a place where, because of the information revolution, technology, whatever, right? But we are at a place where I think we recognize that systemically we need to move beyond where we are right now. And the only way that we're going to do that is by creating the kind of mass movement that we need in order to shift not just sort of the perception. I love this diagram that Navina does, where there's 3 sort of concentric circles, and there's the real, the ideal on 2, or not the fake and the ideal solutions on 2 ends, and then there's this middle one, which is the real. And so we are constantly trying to move our issues, the ideal issues, into the realm of what is the real, what we can achieve. And I think we have gotten to a place now where all of our organizations understand that the real just got real red. I mean, we can actually achieve some of the things that we thought were ideal because of where we are, because of historically the moment that we're living right now. So I'm actually personally optimistic about where we can move this whole conversation, where we can go from here. And I think for the sake of where we go next, right, I think the next panel is going to delve into some of the questions that are more nitty-gritty on that specific topic.
And just to add one more thing, from my vantage point in DC, we've seen, and I think I'll go back to the Monsanto Protection Act defeat as I think a watershed moment for the food movement, which has become a political movement. And the defeat of the Monsanto Protection Act was largely symbolic. But what it did is, with members of Congress and their staff, now when they hear the word or the name Monsanto, it means something more than just the company. It is a symbol of something. And I think that that's something that we can all take credit for defeating that. And then hopefully, maybe just like now, with the DOJ hearings, that DuPont and Monsanto, they had some conflicts that got resolved. The DOJ workshops were kind of swept under the rug. But we can use the defeat of the Monsanto Protection Act maybe as the way to take that watershed moment and move past. We need to focus on 2,4-D resistant crops. How can we use that to leverage? So I think there are some new case studies. And so maybe when we're talking about the Smithfield merger, we can also be talking in the same breath about fast track and why we need to be defeating fast track. But I think taking the political movement that is now the food movement and helping to leverage that, we do have new voices, and with even more voices coming into Congress, it may be complete dysfunction, but we still need to play the game.
And I think that is an example of Monsanto Protection Act victory of changing the narrative of what that means something different now in public dialogue than it did before, and I think there's such power in that. So just to close, I wanted to thank our panelists very much. I think one of the and I just want to encourage folks to keep that power soccer metaphor in your mind. I think it has a lot of interesting questions and lessons about which rules do we break. On that bigger team, how do we take that power away from the smaller team? Is it important to influence the referee, and when? Who's leading the organizing of that bigger team and the defining of the new rules? I think it's just a really good way, and I thank you for that metaphor. And thanks everyone for your participation as well. Pass it back.